Be more participants arriving, but we've got an introduction section to go over first. So today's webinar will be a little lengthy, and so I do want to get started as soon as possible. So welcome to today's Documentary Heritage and Preservation Services for New York webinar on preservation and exhibits. We've got a pretty large group today, and please feel free to use the chat box to send questions that you might have as we go along, or notify us of any technical difficulties that you might have. I'll probably be responding to some questions as we go along, others I'll hold until the end. And Jason Henn, the DHPSNY Communications Assistant, will be helping me with fielding questions and any technical difficulties that might occur. I see Deborah doesn't have any sound. It's like touching. Yeah, the microphone should be on, so please let me know if you. Uh-oh. Well, I'll let Jason field the sound problems. Just so that you are aware, the presentation is being recorded and will be available on our website next week. And to get started, I will introduce myself. I am Amelia, the Archives Specialist for DHPSNY. Many of you have already met me at workshops or at site surveys. I usually do the archival assessments. Okay, it looks like other people are having sound. That's good. Okay, so DHPSNY is a collaboration between two long-running New York programs, the New York State Archives Documentary Heritage Program and the New York State Library Conservation Preservation Program. It was established in 2016 by the New York State Education Department's Office of Cultural Education to ensure consistent and comprehensive services to the vast network of organizations that safeguard New York's records and make them accessible. The Conservation Center for Art and Historic Artifacts, they are the administrators of the grant contract. And just to be clear, documentary heritage and conservation preservation programs are still funding projects outside of DHPSNY, so please keep applying for those grants. Okay, so a little bit about our organization. DHPSNY, or the Documentary Heritage and Preservation Services for New York, is an initiative to deliver essential training and services to New York's collecting institutions. DHPSNY services include archival needs assessments, preservation and conservation surveys, guidance with strategic planning, and access to a variety of educational programs and workshops. It was established in 2016 by the New York State Education Department's Office of Cultural Education. All of the services that we offer are free of charge to New York-based organizations that collect, preserve, and make accessible historical records or library research materials. We have some upcoming webinars you should keep an eye out for: cold storage, mold, and housing material basics. We're taking a break from workshops for the winter. However, workshops will start again in April, so check our website out for updates. Okay, so when talking about preservation and exhibits, we're going to start at the beginning with planning. And especially if you have never created an exhibit, it can be really daunting to get started. So for many of you, the archive is somewhat separate from the museum and exhibits. Often the materials in archives can be overlooked because so many records are not visually interesting. However, the information in the records can be fascinating. So exhibits are really a great way to introduce the audience to your archives and holdings, to connect the topic of the exhibit with community events and history. Makeovers can be creative, dynamic, and fun. It can revitalize your museum and bring in new visitors. And because of the unique problem with some of the nature of records in archives, you may need to act as an advocate for your archival collections and seek out the curator and keep updated on any upcoming exhibits in that museum and try to find archival material that supports those exhibit topics. This picture here is a picture of a current exhibit at Cornell University, and it features materials on witches and witchcraft, which come from their archive. And I thought that this was a really great example of how they're using video, and I think I also saw photos of oversized graphics to complement the books and documents from their that type of artifact. So there are ways to spice up those archival materials. Okay, so there are whole books written on the developing exhibits, on the topic of developing exhibits, and you'll see a lot of those in the bibliography and resources at the end. But today we're focusing primarily on preservation. However, exhibition topics is a really important part of planning a good exhibit. So here are just a few starter ideas. You always want to relate your exhibit topic to your mission statement. They should support the mission statement, and your topic should be rooted in scholarship and community knowledge. You can also look to current events and pop culture for inspiration. Maybe as you're browsing through the archive or processing collections, you find really interesting stuff. Maybe an interesting new donation comes in. There's also maybe that underused collection that you particularly like that you think deserves more attention. I know one of my favorite collections that I worked with were records from a plant nursery, and at first glance they may have looked like it wouldn't make a great exhibit, but I always thought that it would have been a great exhibit to connect the letters on where the nursery owner he liked to go out and find native plants. So there were all these letters about locations where he could find these unique native plants, and I thought that would be a great exhibit to connect those letters with maps or plant pressings and how naming taxonomies came about. You can also look at historic anniversaries for your area. I know tons of museums in New York took advantage of the 100th anniversary of the Erie Canal to create exhibits on canal buildings, industries that use the canals, and other related topics. You can also look to topics of local interest or create exhibits that complement programming going on at other local institutions. Okay, and this is really only a small partial list of the things that you might need on your budget. Your budget will be unique to your institution and your exhibit. And just as a personal plea, so many institutions combine the archives and preservation budget with exhibits. These should be separate. So please, please don't take money away from your regular preservation activities. Those are necessary parts of your institution. Okay, so let's take a look at how you get started and how you should select objects for your exhibit. So even before planning an exhibit, you should have an exhibition policy. And your policy should cover basics such as the function of exhibits, committees, preservation, timeframes, assign responsibilities to staff positions, determine who's in charge of security, access issues, and documentation guidelines. And for documentation, those guidelines cover a lot of things. So you need object documentation that will cover things such as provenance and accession records. You need research documentation, and this helps support the authenticity of the artifacts you use. It connects the artifacts to the exhibit theme, and it expands the context of the object. You also need exhibit documentation, and this would include inventories and condition reports and anything else that you might think is necessary. Okay, if you already have an exhibit program, you may not need a year to prep an exhibit. However, if you're starting out and are doing a total space makeover, Make sure that you give yourself lots of time and create a timeline to help guide the project. Also, expect things to go wrong and allow extra time to make up for that. Giving yourself enough time is also part of the preservation strategy. Things are more likely to be damaged when you are in a rush. And having a team or even just one partner will make a better exhibit. Make sure that if you do have a team and a partner, you assign responsibilities and it's very clear what each of you need to do. Research takes a lot of time. You'll need to choose your items, gather documentations. Making an exhibit mock-up can require a lot of time, and also the construction and installation. Okay, so when planning out the space for your exhibit, you would use floor plans. You need to know which cases and frames are available to you. The floor plans, these can help you design an effective layout, they can guide traffic, and it's also a helpful tool to let you visualize how to group together objects of the same theme. By separating different themes in your exhibit, this is an effective storytelling strategy. And as for the cases, again, take an inventory of what you have and what would be appropriate to use, and also see if you need to purchase any cases. If you do, add that to your budget. Take a look to see how much light is in your space. So you should be monitoring light and climate long before installing an exhibit because this will dictate which objects you can have on display. Okay, now for selecting objects. We always recommend that you use facsimiles wherever possible, especially for permanent exhibits. Damage, especially from light, is irreversible. So once that object has faded, you are never getting the information back. Make sure that the objects you choose are physically stable. That would include previous damage, things that are already faded, anything that's flaking off. Also consider the resources and skills that you have for creating mounts. If you can't properly support an object, don't use it. Avoid light-sensitive objects, so inks such as pen inks, especially anything colored. Photos are very light-sensitive, and textiles. Light can also be damaging to feathers, dyed leather, some plastics, works of art on paper, and really all organic material is somewhat sensitive to light. So do keep that in mind, especially for those permanent exhibits. Make sure the objects you select are relevant to the theme of the exhibit, that you can support the use of those documents by research, and that they are authentic artifacts. As a trusted institution of the public, the public expects you to present accurate information. That's why the research part is so important. There are also aesthetic considerations. You do want to choose the things that are visually interesting. However, there are ways to make handwritten letters or old business records more interesting. If you use a facsimile in your exhibit, you can highlight information of interest. You can also make an enlarged copy of a portion of the document or provide a typed manuscript in the label. Also, choose some extra objects, especially for a lengthy exhibit, and plan out your object rotation. Not only is that a great way to highlight more artifacts in your collection, but it also helps minimize damage from exhibits. Okay, and we'll talk a little bit about design, but again, there are whole books on this, and some of those will be in the resources at the end. So when you're thinking about design, you want to think about, does the display convey what you intend? And it can be surprising what other people see. So it's always good to get a second opinion, pull an intern over and make them give you some feedback. Consider using dynamic groupings as well as single items. And remember, less is more. This banana exhibit is pretty spectacular, but talk about museum fatigue. You'd never be able to see all of the banana objects in that room. So when you have fewer objects, people can really take the time to understand the meaning of them and why they are historically important. Also make sure that your objects are clearly labeled. Um, and are the items secure? So also you want to think about your labels and the mounts. These are functional. They should not detract from the exhibit. And as far as securing your items, this is both from shifting over time as well as theft. Okay, let's talk a little bit about handling and preservation. Okay, so climate and light control are one of the most important steps you can take towards preserving materials on exhibit. Hopefully you've started this before objects are on display. The chart here are general guidelines, and remember that the goal for UV is always 0. However, there are max levels that are acceptable here in the right-hand column. And with filters, that measurement of 0 UV is almost possible. UV light readers can be expensive, but a good way to test light levels is with a blue wool card, and you can find those with archival supply distributors. I would even advise placing those wool cards in exhibit cases for continued monitoring. There are several options out there for decreasing light levels. There are UV filters for windows, light fixtures, and for the exhibit cases themselves. LED lights are a great option. They do not produce UV light, and there is very little heat emitting from the LEDs, which is also important when lighting cases. Tungsten lights produce less UV than fluorescents. Also consider things such as motion detectors and time shutoff to minimize the amount of overall light on the exhibit. Wool cards. Oh, yes, they're wool cards. So it's a tiny little card, and it has different small strips of wool that has been dyed blue, and each of the blue dyes have different amounts of light sensitivity. There's instruction with the cards, but it's a really great way to see how fast something is fading. Okay, climate control. Okay, so you want to regulate the temperature, humidity, and air movement. I'm not talking much about loans in this webinar due to time limits. However, many of these concepts, such as climate control, should be considered for loans and shipping. Just as you need to control climate in your exhibit space, you also need to control and buffer climate fluctuation when shipping loan items. And you would do that through packing and housing strategies. New research indicates that some flexibility in ranges of temperature and humidity levels over time may be safe for some materials as long as there are not extended periods of extreme conditions. There also needs to be careful environmental monitoring and data analysis in place. This is good news for a lot of institutions who find it difficult to maintain a constant 70 degrees year-round. So incoming air affects the temperature and humidity of your space, not to mention the problems a direct blast of air can cause to the stability of your exhibits. If possible, avoid exhibits and lobbies. Try to have doors or barriers at the entryway of exhibit spaces. Also keep in mind that outdoor air can bring pollutants with it, and these can accelerate degradation. Maintain good communication with facilities so you know how well your air handling unit is working. And keep monitoring the climate to see if the amount of visitors will require some tweaking to the system. Your goal is to minimize thermal stratification, which can happen as hot air rises and cool air falls, and this can be caused by museum lights, windows, and humans. This is good to keep in mind, especially if you have objects displayed at various heights. The takeaway here is basically keep that air moving. Okay, so the most basic handling rule is to use common sense. It doesn't make sense to try to juggle 3 objects at once. You don't have 3 hands, or to hold things by their most sensitive areas. But just to make sure that we're all on the same page as far as common sense goes, I'll elaborate. So make a plan before you begin. Don't just move things around. Before handling an artifact, examine it closely and take a look at condition reports if possible. This way you'll know if there are any past problems and areas to avoid, like old repairs, structural weaknesses, and parts which cannot bear weight. Always handle one artifact at a time, and don't be afraid to get a friend or two to help out. In general, avoid handling artifacts unless you have to. If you are physically holding an artifact, you've just upped the chances of dropping it or otherwise damaging it. Some of this can be avoided by using carts. That way you aren't risking losing your grip or tripping or something like that while holding the object. In order to minimize vibrations from the cart, it's helpful to use elevators as well and foam padding. This is also why we suggest using placeholders or cheap facsimiles when planning your exhibit. And during the installation phase, make sure that you have your route planned out. Make sure the path is wide enough and that any large objects can clear the corners. Okay, so we'll talk a little bit about handling paper. Flat paper should be handled at the edges and supported so that it is not creased. You can either hold on to the edges of a piece of paper or at the corners. And also notice how this woman has a loose grip. It's not loose enough that she drops it, but it's not so tight that she's creating wrinkles or creases. Use a micro spatula or thin cardstock to lift thin, brittle edges of the paper. Charcoals and pastels and other friable media should always remain flat and face up with nothing touching the surface. If a piece is matted, check the direction of the hinges before lifting. The hinges should always be at the top so that the piece is hanging from them. Carrying a matted work upside down can cause the hinges to fail, which can then damage the work. Okay, large flat paper, such as oversized prints, drawings, maps, architectural drawings, these should be supported on a rigid piece of mapboard larger than the item and should be flipped over in a package of 2 pieces of mapboard held tightly together. You should also use more than one person to do this. Only a trained staff member should turn large items. Fragile folded papers should not be unfolded. If an object becomes damaged during handling, do not attempt to repair it. Leave the piece in its current condition and consult a conservator. Place fragile documents on an archival surface like mapboard or blotter, or a flexible, non-woven polyester film for additional support when handling. Documents can be turned more easily this way. This is especially important for fragile, sensitive, and friable works. Using support minimizes contact, which minimizes risk. Okay, so when moving framed items, which could be works of art that are framed, paintings in frames or on stretchers, or even a framed textile, always lift with 2 hands from the bottom or both sides, glazing facing towards you, watching for frame joints, and try to protect it from light whenever possible. Never stack frames or lean them against each other. Make sure that you have an even landing surface or a soft carpeted table or floor. Sorry, excuse me. You can lean paintings against walls if you need to, but make sure that there are carpet feet and barriers or bumpers to prevent the frame from sliding down the wall. Because framed items are so large, it can be impossible to get them through doors if they are laying flat on carts. A-frames are really helpful for this reason. Okay, so gloves or no gloves? This is always the eternal question. I would suggest using nitrile gloves when possible, but sometimes paper will require more dexterity and bare hands makes more sense. Photos should always be handled with nitrile gloves to protect the emulsion from oils on the hands. Cotton gloves are extremely absorbent. They do not allow for much dexterity and easily become as dirty as fingers and hands. The fibers on cotton gloves can also snag or tear paper. Because cotton absorbs so much and quickly becomes dirty, often clean bare hands are preferable to cotton gloves. Unlike paper, gloves must be worn for handling most objects. Again, nitrile gloves are preferred to cotton because of the reasons I mentioned earlier, but also because they make objects like glass slippery. The nitrile provides extra grip. Fingerprints can become etched on metal and lacquerware objects, so it's important to wear gloves when these types of materials are being handled. There are some materials that you do not need to wear gloves with. Oftentimes ceramics are a good example of this, but I would always err on the side of caution if you're uncertain. If you somehow find yourself in a situation where you're not wearing gloves or they're not available, just make sure that your hands are thoroughly washed and dried before handling stuff. And with or without gloves, you should always avoid wearing jewelry, especially rings, but really anything such as a necklace or a belt buckle that can hit the object when you lean over. Okay, when moving objects, it's important to remove any mounts or exhibition hardware. The same is true for frames and paper or books, but there are often strange mounting issues with objects, so it's important to mention some of those here. Like all other handling, use two hands when moving small and medium-sized objects. The best grip is a firm one, but not a tight squeeze. In general, find the most solid area of the object for the initial grip, and never pick up an object by its handles or projecting appendage. Transport separate pieces separately. For example, you would transport a lid and a pot separately from each other, or not so that the lid was on top of the pot. Um, when possible, it's best to avoid physically handling an object at all. So place it in a padded box, cart, or tray, and then you would carry that box or tray. Also, if you use trays or carts, you can move more than one object at a time. Just make sure that there's padding between those objects. Never lift more than 50 pounds by yourself. And make a plan together when lifting with a friend. Pre-plan your route and make sure someone was with you to hold doors, watch out for things that you may not be able to see, study the object, and just be your general spotter. Okay, your workspace is also an important component of this. You'll want to plan out exactly where you're bringing an object for both mount fabrication and exhibit installation, which leads me to a discussion about setting up an appropriate workspace. So make sure that you have a large, clear space ready to go, a landing pad for your item. Do not put an object on the floor where it can be accidentally kicked or stepped on. And your workspace should be secure, as in no unauthorized people are allowed in, but also that the shelving and tables, all of those are sturdy. Make sure that the object is padded at all time, and some good materials to pad with are polyethylene bubble sheeting or bubble wrap, mattress padding, or just blotters for flat paper artifacts. Replace the materials used for padding as soon as it's dirty and make sure that the surfaces in contact with objects are clean. Before you dispose of any of that padding, just do a quick double check and make sure that you're not accidentally tossing any small objects or fragments that may have been overlooked. Also, because you'll be moving around the objects, it's important to ensure that you won't accidentally knock off objects from the table. So you would use weights to prevent that. You can use snake weights or bag weights to sort of create support around an object. And as you see in the picture, you can also use weights on top of flat paper objects. Okay, let's talk a little bit about the materials you need. So this is not a comprehensive list, however, it does cover the basics. All of your materials should meet archival standards such as acid-free, lignin-free, no VOCs, which we'll cover in a minute, And all materials should be stable and inert. Once your exhibit is installed, especially in enclosed cases, frames, or even rooms, this becomes really important. If the installation and the mounting materials you start to use corrode, degrade, or off-gas, this will cause damage to the archival materials you have on display. As you are planning an exhibit, as early as the research and object selection stages, start brainstorming and taking notes on what types of mounts each object will require and the supplies needed to create those mounts. This information will be helpful for your budget. Okay, so the paints that you can use are acrylic, latex, shellac, and make sure that you let the case or wall that you paint aerate for at least 3 weeks. Plastics can be used to make mounts, straps, or even be part of the background design. Some people like to have graphics or text printed on plastics. Just make sure that you stick only to the types of plastics that we list here. Adhesives. As mentioned earlier, with the exception of wheat paste hinges, adhesives should never be used on collection material. And yes, that means archival tape too. The term archival has become nearly meaningless as a descriptor for preservation materials. Archival tape should never be used on collection materials. It is not reversible, and it will damage the material if you try to remove it. It should never be used for mount supports or for mending. Now that I've gone on a little rant about archival tape, do keep in mind that these adhesives are considered acceptable to use in exhibit installation because they are inert and stable. But once again, they are only for creating mounts, insulating cases, and creating props. Okay, so mechanical fasteners include items such as pins, nails, screws, hinges. Basically, you just don't want any of these to be made of metals that could possibly corrode. Um, Fabrics are often used as backdrop or to line cases. And here are some material types that are acceptable to use. You don't want to use any protein-based fabrics like wool or silk, and always wash the fabric that you're using before using it. Fabric manufacturers often use sizing or even formaldehyde in the fabrics. And your paper products should be acid-free and unbuffered for photos and protein-based materials, and it should be acid-free and buffered for other materials. Oh, one place wanted to use acid-free pencils. Wait, two up from that? I'm sorry, I'm not sure which. Oh, okay. Oh, is there a designated state of New York digital storage space? Not exactly. There's the Empire, uh, oh shoot, I can't remember. Yeah, what is it? I think the Empire State Digital Network that you can look into. There's also something that is still in the kind of testing phases for digital images, but there is not a designated place to store your digital files. So yeah, you guys kind of have to take care of that on your own. Sorry. Um, okay, so let's look at materials you want to avoid. So VOCs are volatile organic compounds. They are emitted as gases from certain solids or liquids. They may have short-term and long-term adverse health effects. This comes from the EPA. As well as health effects, they will also irreversibly damage your archival materials. Things to avoid, lots of woods are problematic, such as the ones listed here. Woods that you can use are seasoned spruce, mahogany, Walnut, basswood, poplar, and balsa are acceptable. I think there are also some tropical hardwoods that are okay. However, those are going to be pretty expensive. Um, for laminate woods, definitely avoid masonite, chipboard, particle board, interior plywood. A lot of the glues that are putting those together have formaldehyde in them. So if you're in a bind and you have to use some sort of laminate wood, at least make sure that you're getting laminates that are formaldehyde free. Um, but you still have the wood acidity to be concerned about. For plastics, most plastics you shouldn't use. Stick only to the plastics that were listed before. You should avoid oil, latex, and polyurethane paints and varnishes. And pretty much no glues should be used other than the ones that we mentioned earlier. And this is not a perfect solution. All of the materials that we do recommend, these are not perfect solutions. Um, There's also going to be pollutants carried in through the air from the outside. So to combat some of these issues, you can use buffering materials such as zinc oxide pellets or activated carbon, and that can help reduce some of the harmful gaseous compounds within cases. Just make sure that they are in sealed packets and that they are not directly touching the artifacts. Uh, just a little note on microclimates. Microclimates can occur in cases, frames, someplace with dead air. It's basically just a small area with a climate that is different or even just slightly different from the climate around them. Um, what can happen, especially in cases, is there can be a buildup in the concentration of VOCs, which can be very damaging to the collection materials in that area. That's why you want to avoid these materials. Okay, there is something called the Audie test, and basically this is a procedure created at the British Museum by conservation scientist Andrew Audie in 1973 in order to test materials for safety in and around art objects. Materials may emit trace amounts of chemicals that can harm art objects over time. Acids, formaldehydes, and other fumes can damage and even destroy delicate artifacts. So the AIC has been compiling some of these results. You can take a look at which ones pass or fail, and that can help you decide what you might want to use in your exhibits. The link above will take you to that research. The British Museum and the Getty also have resources on Audie tests that they have conducted. Okay, these vendors are in no particular order, and we aren't necessarily advocating for them, but these are vendors who do carry good preservation standard supplies. They, however, do carry materials that are not necessarily archival, so make sure that you read what the materials are actually made out of. Also, when purchasing your exhibit materials, don't rule out art supply stores, upholstery stores, and hardware stores. Just again, make sure that you know what your materials are made from. Okay, let's go over some of the options out there for cases and frames. So hood and tabletop cases are virtually the same, except the tabletop is shallower, which makes it easier to access the interior. There should be 5 transparent sides. They're fairly inexpensive, at least as far as cases go. Um, they will be airtight if the silicone sealant is well done, and that provides good climate control. There's also good security with these if there are locks or security screws as part of the case. Some of the disadvantages to these large cases can be really hard to access. You would need at least 3 people to lift up some of those larger hoods, and lighting could be a challenge. There's usually glare that you have to combat coming from outside lighting. And by the way, some of the vendors that I listed earlier will sell cases and frames. Freestanding cases, or are also sometimes called modular. They usually are a moderate to high cost, and standard sizes will be cheaper. They're pretty easy to access the interior as one side is a door. You can install shelves inside to increase the amount of material that can be displayed. It can be really hard to transport prefabricated ones, and the assembly and sealing of the glass sides can be really challenging if you have no prior experience. Um, and remember, those seals determine the climate control quality. Also, if you're purchasing one of these, make sure that there are good locks on the doors. Some don't come with locks at all, and that is a security problem. And remember, we always advise that you do not light the cases from inside. However, if there is lighting inside, make sure that it's using LED lighting. Wall cases, the access is usually pretty easy. It's either a slide or hinged door. Just make sure that there's enough surrounding room to open the doors. These can be moderate to expensive. Installation can be difficult, and you really need to consider the load-bearing capacity of your walls. And again, these will provide good climate control as long as the glass is sealed properly. Also, again, these should not be lit from the inside unless using LED lights. I want to quickly go over some of the advantages and disadvantages for glass and acrylic glazing. Whatever you decide, it's a personal choice. People use both, and they are both completely acceptable. It's just whatever you prefer. There are some considerations, though. So, I mean, glass is much heavier than the acrylic. However, if you've ever tried to lift a really large acrylic hood off of a tabletop case, they can be really wobbly. Um, if you do use glass, make sure that you order 6 to 10 millimeter safety glass or low iron float glass. And you should have heavier thicknesses for cases that people might rest their arms on or set something on top of. In general, glass ages better. The acrylic tends to scratch and possibly crack over time. Acrylic also attracts dust, so you do have to come through and clean them more frequently. Glass tends to be more secure, and if there's a fire, God forbid, the acrylic could melt. Okay, so we're going to look a little bit at picture frames. So proper framing will protect the framed object from environmental pollutants, insect damage, and fluctuating humidity with a sealed package microclimate. Photographs are frequently used in exhibits and are especially vulnerable to damage from their environment, so following these steps is imperative. Of course, you can always use facsimiles, and then you wouldn't have to make such an elaborate mat. Just saying. Okay. A lot of people would like to reuse those beautiful old frames, but there are some considerations to think about. You always want the frame to be larger than the object to provide room for matting. You may have to use a smaller facsimile of the original, or you can contact a conservator to see if there's options such as routing out the frame. The frame also needs to be deep enough to accommodate replacement or the addition of materials, including the backing boards and sealing packages. Sometimes a frame can be built up on the back, but again, you need to consult a conservator on this. Okay, when purchasing your mats, and mats can be used for mounting as well as framing, so it's important to make sure you're buying the right stuff. You want preservation quality mat board and backing board. The mat boards should have a thickness of 8 ply, and this is thicker than your traditional mat board. And you need that extra thickness to keep artifacts from the glazing. There is always a risk that the artifact can adhere to the glazing, especially with photographs. Okay, on the left side, you see some pictures of a window mat. That is your most common matting that you see. There's one hinged edge, and the object is supported with hinges, corners, or channels, which we'll talk about in a minute. These window mats are also really great for storing works of art on paper or fragile, oversized objects because they give stability and protection. Um, on the right here, we have a sink mat, and these are for objects with thick supports or planar distortions. This right here is a particularly nice example of a sink mat for a parchment document. If you look closely, you can see how the document is warped, and having that sink mat and the extra space will help protect the item and prevent it from, the physical stress of it being flattened out when it doesn't want to be flat. The document is attached by several hinges along the edges, and something like this should definitely be framed by a conservator. Okay, you'll need rigid backing boards, and we talked a little bit about blue boards earlier in the materials section. You can also use Ticor, which is made from alpha cellulose. And these are the types of materials used to keep the glazing, mat, and backing board in place. The first two, glaziers points and offset clips, are your best options. Brads can damage a frame, especially the old and brittle frames. And again, remember, if you're reusing a frame, don't reuse old holes. Okay, and the last step would be your dust cover and your seal, and that functions pretty much just like its name. It protects the interior from dust and pollutants as well as a buffer to fluctuating humidity. And while this is considered best practice, it's not necessary if it's a short-term exhibit. If you have your frames done professionally, there will be labels giving care instructions on the back. And anything other than a sealed package really doesn't seal or keep air out, so keep that in mind. Here are examples of some good hardware to use on the back. Most of the resources that I looked at only recommended using D-rings, so if you have a choice, go with the D-rings. I also want you to note how the wire is both knotted and wrapped several times to provide extra security. Okay, on to mounts. So here are some mounting basics. Do not ever alter the object to fit the mount. This means no drilling holes or bending or imposing stresses of any kind. Make sure that objects are supported completely, and I'll show you some examples of this. Place the object at its center of gravity, and if that means that an object needs to lay on its side to be displayed, then you need to create a mount to support that position. Use placeholders and facsimiles when creating your mounts. Do not try an unfinished mount on the actual object. And your placeholders or facsimiles, these can be photocopies or just a piece of paper cut to the dimensions of the original. For 3D objects, you're going to have to get creative. Okay, so all mounts should be cleaned and padded when appropriate. Once your mount is finished or pulled from storage, make sure you wipe it down with a clean cloth. And most paper and books don't need padding. Mounts need to protect the object from vibrations and other physical forces. The entire exhibit system should be designed to protect from physical and environmental dangers. Mounts should never be permanently attached to the artifact. That means no glue, no museum wax. These can be used to build and support mounts, but should never touch the object. If the object shape fluctuates, the mount must accommodate for that. So parchment, objects with laminate structures or separate pieces, and even paper and photos to some extent tend to expand or bend with fluctuations in temperature and humidity. Your mount should allow for these natural movements. Again, your mount should utilize inert material, and they should be secured with pins, wires, tubing, weights, or straps, but everything should be removable or reversible. And any sharp edges should be either sanded down, removed, or padded out. Okay, so this is an example of a book. And if you notice here at the bottom, I don't know if you can see my mouse, but right at the bottom there, they put in some extra mat board to prevent the pages of the book, and this will prevent stress on the binding. The reason that they would have needed to do that for the book, sorry, let's go back, is because the book is standing upright vertically. If the book was laying horizontally, you wouldn't need to support the pages separately because you wouldn't have that vertical stress from gravity. Okay, so here is a jug from the Museum of American History, and if you look closely, you can see that plinth or bar is actually hand painted to blend in with the object. I mean, that is really going above and beyond, but they did an excellent job trying to hide that. And that little bar also has a curved edge that goes over the lip of the jug to secure it from the top. And if you look towards the bottom, there is wire that is covered in tubing wrapped around the base for security both on the top and bottom. The picture to the right from the Block Museum, this is more of a non-traditional type of mounting, and the mounts are actually completely invisible and underneath the objects, which rest on just a covered platform. So they created mount supports with Volara foam and then secured them in place with either clear or colored thread. So there are lots of different methods out there for securing the objects, and there are a lot of really great blogs that describe how these things are done. So if you're interested, take a look. It's Volara foam, V-O-L-A-R-A. All right, here on the left, this necklace is supported on a custom acrylic base, and they cut the acrylic base in the shape of all the necklace protrusions for additional support. That's one way you can do, and you can actually make your own acrylic frames mounts. We are not going into that today because it is complicated, but it is possible, and there are workshops out there to cover that. I also wanted to show you an example of what not to do, especially since this is something I have seen several times. This tool is, I guess it is fairly secure in that probably can't be yanked off the wall, although you could argue that it might be able to be pulled out of the chains. But those chains are really poor examples of something to secure your item with. The chain is abrasive and will probably be scratching the handle. That hammer is also resting directly against a painted wall without any sort of barrier between the two. So that's something that you'd want to fix. And there's also no barrier in between the artifact and the visitors. So it would be pretty easy for somebody to reach over and touch it. And I'm not even going to get started on whatever that green sticker is. That should definitely not be there. Okay, book cradles. We're going to talk a little bit about those. So basically, a book cradle supports the boards and spines of a book at an angle of opening that is appropriate for that book. Support should be over as large an area as is practical, and attached parts such as straps or clasps on the book may require independent support. So when we were uploading this presentation, the tiny diagram did not work out. However, it is an attachment that you can download from the little files box, and it provides a diagram of how to make a particular type of book cradle. This is actually what the finished product would look like, and it's made out of mat board. This is just one of many designs that you can use. If you are new to mount fabrication, I would suggest making practice ones first and using just a regular book as your guinea pig rather than something that's rare and fragile. In order to set the book at an angle for easier viewing, you can create a wedge shape, and It's a similar principle to making the cradle. Making wedges is also a really useful skill for your flat mounts. This is another design. It's a little less stable than the how-to instructions that I provided you. So something like this wouldn't be good for a heavy book, but it's fine for something that's more lightweight. Book straps are an important part of your book cradles because the cradle isn't enough to properly support the book. Once you have the book in the cradle, you probably want it open to a particular page and you don't want it to slip and fall off the mount, so that's where the straps come in. And you can make ones that are nearly invisible with Mylar. This right here is a diagram showing how it should be done. So the wide strap holds the bulk of the weight, and then you use a second narrower strap on top of that. You can also use a sling method, which is great for really heavy books. Okay, so here's a picture of some book cradles that are invisible to the viewer. And this wouldn't work if you wanted the book at the angle. This does actually need to be flat, but you can see a little bit of how it's constructed from the view going up from the bottom. You can also use the same concepts for making a book cradle to create mounts for your 3D objects. Okay, on to flat mounts. And these techniques can be used for framed and matted pieces as well as for simple flat mounts. The pass-through hinge, to do that, you would cut holes in the mat board on the left. Those are where the little blue tabs are pointing towards. And your tissue or hinge would pass through those holes. If you flip the object up, you see the hinge on the back, and you see the hinge continuing onto the back side of the mat board. This one's a little complicated. It's not one that I prefer using, but I figured I'd show you the method just in case. The V-hinge is more common, and again, the hinges are invisible from the front, and you can flip the object over. Well, you can flip it up and over. And the tissue is so hard to see, so I outlined one of them in the turquoise lines, but you can see how the hinge does form a V shape. You've got one half adhered to your object and one half adhered to the front side of the mat. Mounting strips or channel strips are really great. You can make them out of Japanese tissue, paper, or Mylar if you want them to be invisible. It's a really good method for fragile, brittle objects or objects that you need to take in and out of its mount. Tissue is great for delicate items that you want to be very secure from shifting or from friction. And on the right-hand picture, notice how the top corners are folded up. That just provides a little more security and stabilization. If you create a mount base that is flush with the artifact, Mylar is a great way to make the supports invisible, or at least nearly so. And if you want an invisible mount, you just cut the mount board to the same size as the artifact and then adapt some of these support techniques. This is a drawn diagram of how you would make edge strips. And here's a picture of how complex they can get in order to adapt to a non-square piece. Okay, corners are also a really great way to support pieces. Oh, and I did sneak a picture of a Mylar edge strips on this slide. You don't have to purchase strips either. You can make them yourself, even out of Mylar. If you've got Mylar sheeting, you can cut the strips to the width and length you want, and then use a bone folder to get a nice crisp edge. Photo corners can be purchased or made as well, and they're pretty much good for everything, although if you notice on the folder how there's a tear in the newspaper, If you have really brittle paper, you would probably want to use edge strips over corners since the edge strips can protect the entire length and there will be less chance of damage that way. Okay, here are some pictures of how mounts have been mounted vertically. So you can see the little book cradle is attached to a vertical wall using push pins. Just make sure that whatever fastener you use is strong enough to hold the weight of the mount and the object. And here and on the right are some flat papers vertically mounted. Again, if you want them at an angle, you would create a wedge out of mat board. And I wanted to show you this because it is a very complicated mount. However, it uses a combination of both the flat mount for the protruding piece of paper and a book cradle. So the flat mount is actually attached to the mylar strap to give it that support and make it look like it's floating. Okay, if your visitors don't know what's on display, then what is the point? So labels are the way that you're going to connect the story and the theme to the object. And so here are just some basics you want to consider when creating your labels. You always want to mount your label on a board. I have seen so many examples of sagging or curling labels. It just looks unprofessional. If you have your objects as a single item or a group of items, there are ways to address that. And I like this diagram on the right from the book Exhibit Makeovers, giving an example of how you can provide a single label for a group of objects. Labels should always be typed. The information should be clear and concise. And remember again, less is more. This goes for the amount of objects on display as well as the amount of text that you give visitors to read. I have seen guidelines that state single item labels should take 10 seconds to read or be 150 words, and exhibit text should only be 300 words or take 1 minute to read. Again, these are only guidelines, but again, that idea of less is more is important. Try to keep the most important information first and proofread. Also, don't go crazy with fonts and colors because the objects are what's on display, not the labels. Part of labeling has to do with accessibility. So these are things that you want to consider. All exits need to be clearly marked and unobstructed. There should be directional signage, and that should have lettering that is 3 inches tall with high contrast between the text and the background. Keep in mind wheelchairs need 36-inch wide pathways, and protruding objects should never be more than 4 inches deep. You should have rails at low levels for people who are visually impaired, and all carpets and cords should be securely attached. There are more ADA standards that you can get from this website, and it's always good to consider when creating your exhibit spaces. Okay, and we want to talk about security. So when talking about security, I'm also referring to the intellectual and physical control of the objects. Intellectual control of the objects is a security issue as well as a collection management issue. Before selecting objects for exhibition, ensure all documentation is updated and in place. Perform regular inventories throughout the duration of the exhibition, including long-term or permanent installations. Exhibits should be regularly cleaned, so just make the security and inventorying part of that weekly cleaning routine. Clean, dust, check your exhibit for missing pieces and for any objects that have shifted or slipped. Okay, communication is a key component of security. So you need to make sure you know who is in charge of security. And for most small institutions, you do not have a security guard. So it's going to be left up to staff. So who will be in charge? Is it whoever's on staff that day? Is it the archivist? Is it the curator, the collections manager? Whoever you decide it is, make sure that their duties are clear and maybe even have a checklist, especially if it's an exhibit. Make sure that your staff knows how to report damage or theft, and consider how often your exhibit needs to be monitored. Like, do you want hourly walkthroughs, or maybe just at the end of the day? Okay, and we talked a little bit about accessibility. Safety goes along with that. You need to consider public safety. So, are the sprinklers or fire extinguishers blocked? Um, is the exhibition material constructed from fire retardant material? What are the maximum number of visitors you can handle? Are there cords stretched across the floor? And do you have any staff trained in first aid? There's also staff safety to consider. Are there hazardous materials on display? I mean, you probably shouldn't have any hazardous materials on display, but there are exhibits where that is part of the theme. So how do you protect your staff from that? And make sure that you have, a very detailed handling instructions. Also, do you need more than one person for cleaning and maintenance? And how many people do you need for installation and cleaning? Okay, documentation. Again, this is a big part of security. You need to have an inventory of what is on exhibit. And I would also suggest photo documenting the exhibit. Not only is it great for security, but it's also great for your exhibit records as well. Make sure that you have all of the necessary paperwork for loan agreements. And don't just monitor the temperature and humidity, you should be recording that data and keeping it as well. And also keep any of the exhibition notes and research and any other sort of important information that comes up relating to the exhibit. And make sure that you know where all of this documentation is to be kept. Okay, object movement. This is also part of security. Many objects have walked off shelves and mounts due to vibrations from visitors walking, external traffic, earthquakes, and construction. So that's why it's really important to have those good mounting techniques employed. Okay, theft and accidental damage. We never want these things to happen, but there's always that chance. So in order to prevent some of this, you want to make sure to secure the exterior. That includes windows, skylights, and doors. Make sure that you have key control procedures in place and make sure that it's very clear who's locking up at night. Make sure you're using the appropriate fasteners. Security screws are a really great way to just kind of give a little boost to your security measures. Security screws have a different or unique type of hole to them, and you would need a special screw head to undo them. Also, make sure that you've got wall fasteners with fish plates for paintings, and use wire to help stabilize items and make sure that they don't shift. We've also talked about some other methods of securing objects such as hinges, thread, tubing. You also want to make sure that you create barriers, and preferably you have cases or glass and plexi barriers that lock, but stanchions are acceptable. Ledges or even a visible barrier such as tape can work too. Cases I know are expensive and they're not always available to you guys. And most of the historic houses that I've been to don't use them. You might want to consider cases though for your most valuable items. And even if your museum is in a house, you have to create a barrier of some type. And although a visual barrier created with tape or paint or a paint outline is not what I would recommend, it is acceptable for a short-term solution. Also, never place valuable materials next to exits. Make sure all visitors have left as part of your closing procedures. I would suggest installing security cameras and never allow food or drink in your museum or food preparation. I worked in a museum one time where for a while they would allow big events to take place inside, including catering and even food cooking. It took us 2 years to wipe all of the food grease off of the walls. It was pretty gross. Okay, so here are a list of resources that I used to compile this webinar, as well as some others that I thought you might find useful. And of course, there's a whole other world out there. If this isn't enough, you can always contact us to see what else there is. Oh, for Carol, your picture, if you look up fasteners, and if you look up fish plates when you're looking for fasteners, say at like Gaylord or University Project Products, a picture of fish plates will come up. Okay, so any questions, you guys? And do remember that this webinar recording will be made available within the next week or so. I don't think that there's a standard for print size or font for labels. You want to make sure that your labels aren't enormous. I always suggest visiting another museum and taking pictures of the labels and stuff that they use if you like them. It's a good way to get you started by looking at what other people are doing. Oh, thank you, Josephine. Oh, for labels, that's just whatever, placard thing you create that has information on what your object is, the date, the artist, if that's applicable, and a little bit of extra information. Oh, you know, I can't think of any specific resources on outdoor exhibits, but I know that there are some. Um, if you would like to email us with that question, then I can see if I can find anything around here and follow up with you on that. Ah, the VOCs do dissipate over time. It probably depends. There are so many individual components to that length of time. It would be hard to estimate. It's always a good idea to repaint over them with the safer paint. So that would be what, acrylic and was it latex? Sorry, I can't remember off the top of my head. To create an additional barrier. A lot of you are going to have this problem with using old particle board, and over time the VOCs are less. So I I don't know. Again, if you want to email me that question, I can look around and see if we've got any information on how long exactly that takes. Maybe there's some research out there. Mary Kay, also you might want to consider the packets of either activated carbon that you can place inside of your cases that will help absorb some of those gaseous compounds. Um, I don't know about test strips to measure. Part of the Audi test is using uh, different corroding metals to determine if there are VOCs in there. So you could read up on the Audi test and see if you can conduct them yourself. You could also look to see if take a look at that link for AIC and see if they've tested any particle board cases. Maybe they've already done the work for you. All right, it looks like the questions have kind of wrapped up, so I'm going to get ready to sign out. But you guys have been a really great audience, so thank you for participating. Oh, a note from Anastasia. I think some of you know her. The SAA is currently reviewing guidelines for archives and special collections facilities, and that will include information on VOCs. So look for that in the future. Oh, and I see a question from Callie. Hello. Different pieces. Um, I think what you mean is using a frame for, okay, do you mean you want to reuse an old frame for an object that wasn't necessarily in it originally? Um, okay, so I mean, aesthetically, if that's what you wanted in an exhibit, as long as you did research to make sure that the time frame of the time the frame was created is the same time period as the object in the frame is created, I think that would be okay. But make sure that you have research to back that up, because remember, your exhibit is kind of putting your own reputation on the line. You need to present accurate information. Um, and then also just keep notes in your exhibit notes, in your archive notes, that you have put an object in a non-original frame. Does that make sense? I hope. Yes, a recording of this presentation will be available in a week or so, and that will be on our website. So that would be dipsny.org. Okay. Yeah, I mean, of course, you could always write in your collection management policy that you are not willing to use old frames to because they're not original. That is completely valid. Yeah, I mean, and also just explaining that the research needs to be done to make sure that the frame and the object are of the same time period. I mean, that's a lot of work, so they may not want to do that. All right, you guys, it was great. I will see you at the next workshop, webinar, or site assessment. Have a great day. Bye.